She walked into divorce court alone. Then the judge said one sentence that changed everything. "You should have hired representation, Valeria." Oliver sneered, adjusting his bespoke silk tie outside the courtroom doors. "Adelaide is going to strip you to the marrow. You'll walk out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back." Valeria stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was entirely alone, devoid of counsel, devoid of allies. "I don't need a lawyer, Oliver," she whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her pale lips. "I just need the judge to read one single piece of paper." The marble corridors of the towering downtown courthouse were designed to make a person feel insignificantly small. The ceilings vaulted into shadowy arches, and the relentless clatter of expensive leather shoes against the polished stone echoed like the ticking of a colossal, unforgiving clock. Valeria sat on a hard wooden bench just outside Department 42, the family law division, a lone figure amidst the chaotic swirl of frantic attorneys, weeping spouses, and impassive bailiffs. She wore a simple, unadorned charcoal dress, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, utilitarian knot at the base of her neck. To the casual observer, she looked exactly like what her soon-to-be ex-husband claimed she was. A defeated, broken woman, stripped of her fight and her fortune. A few feet away stood Oliver Cavendish. Even in the sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory of the legal system, Oliver radiated an infuriating aura of untouchable wealth. His navy pinstripe suit was a masterpiece of Savile Row tailoring, draping perfectly over his athletic frame. His silver-flecked hair was styled with effortless precision, and the gold Rolex Daytona gleaming on his wrist caught the harsh overhead light, throwing tiny, arrogant flashes across the corridor. He looked less like a man facing the dissolution of a 10-year marriage and more like a corporate raider preparing for a hostile, highly profitable takeover. Beside him stood Adelaide, his high-powered, ruthlessly efficient attorney. Adelaide was a terrifying force of nature in the courtroom, a woman who wore her reputation for utterly destroying opposing counsel like a badge of honor. She held a thick, leather-bound portfolio under one arm, her sharp, hawkish eyes occasionally flicking toward Valeria with an expression of thinly veiled contempt. Adelaide didn't just win cases. She eviscerated her clients' spouses, leaving them financially and emotionally destitute. The air between Valeria and her tormentors was thick, heavy with the ghosts of a decade's worth of lies. Valeria kept her gaze fixed on the intricate brass handle of the heavy oak courtroom door. She could feel Oliver's eyes on her, a physical pressure against her skin, heavy with disdain and malicious triumph. He wanted her to look at him. He wanted to see the fear pooling in her dark eyes, to taste the desperation he had spent the last 2 years carefully, systematically cultivating in her. "It's not too late to accept the settlement offer." Adelaide's voice cut through the ambient noise of the hallway, sharp and cold as a scalpel. The attorney took a step closer to Valeria, her heels clicking aggressively. $50,000, Mrs. Cavendish. A clean break, considering the mountain of marital debt my client is graciously offering to shoulder. You should be on your knees thanking him. If we walk through those doors, I will petition Judge Archer for legal fees. And you will leave this building owing us more money than you will ever see in your lifetime." Valeria didn't flinch. She didn't turn her head. She merely adjusted the plain manila envelope resting on her lap, a single, thin folder that contrasted pathetically against Adelaide's mountain of heavily indexed legal binders. "I have read your settlement offer, Adelaide," Valeria said, her voice quiet, steady, lacking the hysterical tremor they both so desperately wanted to hear. "I declined it yesterday. I decline it today." Oliver let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He stepped away from the wall, invading Valeria's personal space. The familiar scent of his expensive Tom Ford cologne washed over her, a smell that used to mean safety, comfort, and home, but now only triggered a cold, hard knot of revulsion in her stomach. "You are delusional, Val," Oliver whispered, his tone dropping into that soft, patronizing cadence he always used when he was gaslighting her. the voice that made her question her own sanity. You have no money. You have no representation. You haven't worked in 8 years. Who do you think the judge is going to believe? A respected investment banker, or a hysterical housewife who couldn't even manage the household accounts without losing thousands of dollars? The memory of those lost thousands flared behind Valeria's eyes. For months, money had been vanishing from her personal checking accounts. When she confronted Oliver, he would look at her with deep, fabricated pity, gently suggesting that she was becoming forgetful, that the stress was getting to her, and perhaps she should see the psychiatrist he had so helpfully recommended. It was a slow, agonizing process of mental erosion, designed to make her believe her mind was fracturing. I'll take my chances with the judge, Oliver, Valeria said, her voice remaining eerily placid. Suit yourself, Oliver sneered, his handsome face twisting into an ugly mask of pure malice. But don't come crying to me when you're sleeping in a shelter. I'm done carrying your dead weight. Just then, the heavy brass handle turned. The oak doors swung outward with a solemn groan, and a stern-faced bailiff stepped into the threshold. Cavendish versus Cavendish, the bailiff called out, his voice booming down the marble hallway. Department 42 is now in session. All parties step inside. Oliver buttoned his suit jacket, shooting one last, triumphant glare at his wife. Showtime, he muttered, strutting through the doors with Adelaide trailing right behind him like a loyal, bloodthirsty hound. Valeria remained seated for a moment longer. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air of the courthouse fill her lungs. She looked down at the thin manila envelope in her hands. It held no thick legal briefs, no character references, no desperate pleas for mercy. It contained a single, irrefutable truth. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her charcoal dress. She wasn't walking into a slaughterhouse, as Oliver so arrogantly believed. She was walking into a trap of her own making, and the jaws were finally ready to snap shut. To understand the sheer magnitude of the reckoning that awaited Oliver Cavendish, one had to understand the meticulous, sociopathic architecture of his betrayal. 5 years ago, the Cavendish marriage had been the envy of their elite social circle. Oliver was the charismatic, high-flying principal of a boutique investment firm, and Valeria was his brilliant, elegant counterpart, an art historian who had paused her promising career to manage their expansive, beautifully curated life. They were a golden couple, their lives a montage of gala dinners, summer retreats in the Hamptons, and whispered promises in the dark. But golden things are often just gilded, and underneath Oliver's charming veneer lay a rot so profound it defied comprehension. The dismantling of Valeria's life hadn't happened overnight. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 paper cuts. It began subtly. A missing piece of jewelry here, an inexplicably overdrawn account there. Whenever Valeria noticed a discrepancy, Oliver was there with a soothing voice and a plausible, yet deeply confusing, explanation. He would twist conversations until Valeria found herself apologizing for bringing it up. He began casually mentioning her lapses in memory to their friends, planting seeds of doubt in their social circle. Then came the grandest, most devastating maneuver of all. Celeste. Celeste had been introduced to Valeria at a charity auction. Stunning, razor-sharp, and seemingly empathetic, Celeste quickly maneuvered herself into the role of Valeria's closest confidant. When Valeria cried over her confusing arguments with Oliver, it was Celeste who poured the wine, patted her back, and softly suggested that perhaps Valeria was under too much stress. Perhaps her memory was failing her. Celeste was the ultimate Trojan horse. What Valeria didn't know, what she wouldn't discover until she was pushed to the absolute brink of destruction, was that Celeste was Oliver's covert business partner and his longtime mistress. They weren't just having an affair. They were executing a financial coup. The plan had been breathtaking in its cruelty. Over the course of 2 years, Oliver slowly funneled the vast majority of their liquid marital assets into an offshore holding company called Apex Holdings. To bypass the legal safeguards that protected Valeria's half of the estate, Oliver needed her signature. He achieved this through a staggering campaign of psychological warfare. During a period where Valeria was heavily medicated on the anti-anxiety pills Oliver's hand-picked psychiatrist had prescribed her, Oliver brought her a stack of dense, convoluted tax documents. "Just sign these, darling," he had murmured, kissing the top of her head as she sat in a drug-induced haze in their sprawling home office. "It's just to protect us from the IRS audit. My lawyers say it's standard procedure." Valeria, desperate to keep the peace, desperate to be a good, supportive wife, had signed them. She didn't know she was signing a sweeping, irrevocable power of attorney, granting Oliver the right to act on her behalf regarding all corporate entities. With a stroke of a pen, she had unknowingly handed him the key to her entire financial existence. Once the assets were secured in Apex Holdings, a company legally structured to appear as Oliver's sole, separate property acquired prior to the marriage, the final phase of the plan commenced. Oliver suddenly became cold, distant, and combative. He stopped coming home. He drained the joint checking accounts, leaving Valeria unable to even pay for groceries without asking him for an allowance. When she finally broke down and demanded to know what was happening, Oliver dropped the mask. "I want a divorce," he had said, standing in the foyer of their $5 million estate, looking at her as if she were a stranger who had tracked mud onto his pristine rugs. "And because of your erratic behavior and financial irresponsibility, my lawyers have ensured you won't see a dime of my hard-earned money." When Valeria tried to hire a lawyer, she discovered her credit cards were canceled, and every prestigious family law attorney in the city had already been consulted by Oliver, creating a deliberate conflict of interest that prevented them from representing her. He had systematically starved her out, isolating her from her friends who now believed Oliver's narrative of her being unstable and leaving her trapped in a sprawling mansion she could no longer afford. For weeks, Valeria had existed as a ghost in her own home. She had sat on the floor of her empty bedroom, the walls closing in, the reality of her total annihilation washing over her. She had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and utterly destroyed by the man she loved and the woman she thought was her best friend. But Oliver had made one fatal miscalculation. He believed that breaking a person's heart also broke their mind. He assumed that because Valeria was gentle, she was weak. He didn't realize that when you strip a woman of everything she has left to lose, you do not create a victim. You create a deeply dangerous adversary with unlimited time and nothing but cold, burning clarity. Sitting on the floor that night, staring at a forged bank statement, Valeria hadn't cried. Instead, an eerie, absolute calm had settled over her. She realized she couldn't fight Oliver with a lawyer she couldn't afford, in a court system he had already manipulated. She needed to fight him in the shadows. She needed to find the money. And she knew exactly who to look for. Oliver Cavendish was a brilliant man, but his arrogance left a trail of collateral damage, and Valeria knew that in a man's discarded wreckage, one could often find his greatest vulnerabilities. 3 years prior, there had been a hushed scandal at Oliver's firm. A senior data analyst had been unceremoniously fired and subsequently investigated by the SEC for insider trading. Oliver had publicly played the betrayed mentor, deeply saddened by his employees' ethical failings. But Valeria had always noticed how quickly Oliver changed the subject when the analyst's name came up, and how fiercely he guarded the home office safe during that period. The analyst's name was Gideon. Finding Gideon had taken Valeria 2 weeks of relentless, quiet searching through public records on a burner phone. She eventually tracked him down to a dilapidated apartment complex on the industrial edge of the city, a far cry from the glass and steel towers of the financial district. When Valeria first knocked on Gideon's chipped wooden door, it was opened by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. Gideon was painfully thin, his eyes ringed with dark shadows, surrounded by the chaotic glow of multiple computer monitors crammed into a tiny, smoke-stained living room. Oliver Cavendish's wife, Gideon had rasped, his voice dripping with venom. "Did he send you to finish the job?" "Because I have nothing left to take." "Oliver didn't send me," Valeria had replied, stepping into the dim apartment uninvited. "I'm here because he's trying to do to me exactly what he did to you, and I want to burn his empire to the ground. I need your help." Gideon had laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. But when Valeria pulled out the handful of scrambled, redacted financial statements she had managed to photograph from Oliver's locked desk, the laughter stopped. Gideon was a savant with numbers. To him, a ledger was a language, and the documents Valeria provided were speaking volumes of hidden fraud. That night was the beginning of a clandestine, relentless partnership. For 6 months, while Valeria played the role of the weeping, hysterical wife at home, she was secretly taking the bus across town to Gideon's apartment. Gideon became her phantom architect. He hacked into public registries, traced digital breadcrumbs through international wire transfers, and painstakingly reconstructed the true financial map of Oliver's wealth. It was Gideon who uncovered the existence of Apex Holdings, registered in a notoriously opaque jurisdiction in the Cayman Islands. "He's brilliant, I'll give him that," Gideon had muttered one night. Surrounded by empty coffee cups and printouts of corporate structures, he layered the holding company through 3 different shell corporations. On paper, Apex Holdings is owned by a trust, which is managed by a proxy, which is directed by, wait for it, Celeste. Valeria had felt the blood drain from her face at the mention of Celeste's name. The sheer audacity of it, her husband and her best friend laughing at her behind her back while they funneled millions into a shared offshore account. "But here is the beautiful, fatal flaw in his design," Gideon said, tapping a red pen against a complex corporate diagram. "Oliver is greedy, but he's also a control freak. He didn't want to completely hand over the keys to Celeste. So, to maintain ultimate authority over the trust, he used a specific legal mechanism in the Caymans. He registered the ultimate beneficiary of Apex Holdings not under his own name, because that would trigger marital asset laws in the U.S., but under the name of an authorized spousal representative. He used the power of attorney you signed to name himself your representative, basically making Valeria Cavendish the owner on paper, while he retained all voting and financial rights." Valeria frowned, trying to grasp the complex legal jargon. "So, I own it, but I don't control it?" "Exactly." Gideon smiled, a slow, predatory grin that transformed his exhausted face. "He used your identity as a legal shield. But Oliver made a critical error. The jurisdiction he used updated their corporate compliance laws last year to prevent money laundering. If an authorized spousal representative is proven to be acting under fraudulent pretenses, or if the original power of attorney is legally revoked by the spouse, the proxy crumbles. The ownership defaults instantly and irrevocably to the named individual." "You," Valeria stared at the papers. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying," Gideon leaned in, his eyes blazing with the fire of imminent revenge, "that if we can quietly file a revocation of that power of attorney, and simultaneously file a declaration of fraud with the Cayman Registry, using the evidence I've compiled, Oliver doesn't just lose control of the company." Gideon tapped the paper again. "You become the sole, undisputed, legal owner of Apex Holdings. Every cent he stole from you, every dollar he hid with Celeste, it all becomes yours." But what?" Valeria asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But the timing has to be flawless. If Oliver finds out what we're doing, he will liquidate the accounts and move the money into untraceable crypto within 60 seconds. He has to believe he is winning. He has to walk into that courtroom completely convinced he has destroyed you. Only when he is under oath, committing perjury by claiming those assets are his, do we drop the hammer." And so, the grand deception began. Valeria had to become an actress worthy of an Oscar, playing the fool while holding the guillotine string in her hands. The final 3 months of Valeria's life in the Cavendish estate were an agonizing masterclass in psychological endurance. To ensure Oliver suspected nothing, she had to lean into the narrative he had written for her. She had to become the pathetic, broken woman he expected to see. The estate, A sprawling, modern architectural marvel overlooking the ocean, felt like an icy tomb. Oliver had moved into the guest wing, citing her erratic behavior, while simultaneously cutting off the household staff. Valeria was left alone to wander the cavernous, empty rooms, jumping at shadows, while Oliver paraded his victory. The hardest part was the dinners. Once a week, Oliver would demand she sit with him in the formal dining room, a cruel exercise in establishing dominance. He would sit at the head of the long mahogany table, immaculate in his loungewear, sipping $1,000 Bordeaux, while Valeria picked at the cheap takeout she was forced to buy with the meager cash allowance he left on the counter. Adelaide sent over the preliminary disclosures today, Oliver said casually one Tuesday evening, slicing into a medium-rare steak he had delivered from the city's finest chop house. He didn't offer her any. "I trust you've reviewed them." Valeria kept her eyes down, her hands deliberately trembling as she held her fork. "I tried, Oliver. But the numbers, they don't make sense. You claim you're $5 million in debt. Where did all our money go?" Oliver sighed, an exaggerated, theatrical sound of profound exhaustion. "Valeria, we've been over this." The market turned. My investments tanked. And frankly, your exorbitant spending habits over the last 5 years didn't help. The debt is marital. You're lucky I'm stepping up to assume the bulk of it in the settlement. Most men would leave you drowning. It took every ounce of Valeria's willpower not to reach across the table and drive her steak knife into his smug hand. She knew exactly where the $5 million was. Gideon had tracked it 2 nights prior. It had been wired into Apex Holdings to purchase a luxury yacht registered in Celeste's name. "I don't understand." Valeria forced her voice to break, letting a single, calculated tear slip down her cheek. "I just want this to be over, Oliver. I just want peace." "Then sign the settlement, Val," he replied, his voice smoothing into velvet. He pulled a thick document from his briefcase beside his chair and slid it across the polished wood. "Sign it, and I'll give you $50,000 to start fresh. Refuse. And Adelaide will make sure you are held responsible for half the debt. You'll be working in a diner until you're 80. Valeria looked at the document. It was a masterpiece of legal theft. She reached out, her fingers shaking flawlessly, and touched the pen. She let her breathing become ragged. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fabricated terror. I can't. Not without a lawyer. I need someone to explain it to me." Oliver's eyes darkened, the velvet mask slipping to reveal the shark beneath. "No lawyer will take your case, Valeria. You have no retainer. You have no case. You have nothing." She pushed the paper back, burying her face in her hands, sobbing. The tears were real, but they weren't born of sorrow. They were born of a white-hot, suffocating rage. She cried for the years she had wasted on this monster, for the love she had freely given that had been weaponized against her. Oliver scoffed, standing up and taking his wineglass. "Pathetic," he muttered, turning his back on her and walking out of the room. "Have your little breakdown. But when we get to court, don't say I didn't warn you." As soon as his footsteps faded down the hallway, Valeria lowered her hands. The tears stopped instantly. Her face was a mask of cold stone. She picked up her phone, opened a secure encrypted messaging app, and typed a single message to Gideon. "He's locked in. Execute Phase 2. The next day, while Oliver was at work, Valeria packed a single, medium-sized suitcase. She left behind the designer dresses, the expensive jewelry he had bought her, the trappings of a life that had been a gilded cage. She took only her essentials, her passport, and the encrypted hard drive Gideon had given her. She walked out of the heavy front doors, feeling the salty ocean breeze on her face for the first time in months. She didn't look back. She had a war to win, and the battlefield was being prepared. High above the sprawling metropolis, in a corner office encased in floor-to-ceiling glass, Adelaide poured 2 glasses of vintage Dom Perignon. The city lights glittered below them like crushed diamonds, a fitting backdrop for the celebration of total victory. Sitting across from her, draped casually over a white leather sofa, was Celeste. The other woman looked radiant, dressed in a sleek, emerald green silk blouse that practically screamed illicit wealth. Celeste had a dangerous kind of beauty, sharp cheekbones, piercing green eyes, and a smile that never quite reached them, to a flawless execution. Adelaide purred, handing a crystal flute to Celeste before taking a seat behind her massive obsidian desk. To Oliver, Celeste corrected smoothly, raising her glass. "And to you, Adelaide. Your legal maneuvering was inspired." Adelaide took a sip, savoring the crisp, expensive taste of success. She prided herself on being the best divorce attorney in the state, not just because she knew the law, but because she knew how to break people. "It wasn't particularly difficult, darling. Valeria Cavendish is a remarkably fragile creature. It's almost sad how easily she folded. Most spouses fight back, try to hire forensic accountants, demand discovery. She just wept." Celeste laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Valeria was always weak. She lived in a fairy tale. She actually believed Oliver when he said he was working late. She believed me when I said I was just helping him design the new office space. People like Valeria deserve to lose. They're too stupid to survive in the real world. "Well, her stupidity is our gain," Adelaide said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the final, bound decree sitting on her desk. "Tomorrow at 9 a.m., Judge Archer will finalize the dissolution. I've structured the settlement so perfectly that even if she somehow manages to beg an appellate lawyer to look at it, the paper trail is impenetrable. Oliver retains all assets acquired before the marriage, which, thanks to the Apex holding structure, is magically everything. Valeria gets a token 50,000, and she assumes a legally binding agreement not to pursue any future litigation regarding his corporate entities." Celeste swirled the champagne in her glass, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You're absolutely sure about Apex? The Cayman registry is secure?" "Fort Knox," Adelaide assured her confidently. "I drafted the power of attorney myself. Valeria signed away her rights to inquire, manage, or benefit from any corporate entity Oliver deemed his separate property. It's ironclad. Even if she suspected the money was offshore, she has zero legal standing to even request a subpoena. She's locked out of the castle, and we threw the keys in the ocean." "Good," Celeste murmured, a terrifyingly cold smile spreading across her lips. "Because Oliver and I are flying to Street Bart's tomorrow afternoon to celebrate. I don't want any loose ends." Adelaide leaned back in her chair, a portrait of supreme, blinding hubris. In all her years of practice, she had never been caught, never been outsmarted. She operated under the assumption that whoever had the most money had the most truth. And Oliver Cavendish had all the money, so. What neither of the women in that gleaming glass tower realized was that while they were busy celebrating the construction of their impenetrable fortress, someone else had already quietly changed the locks. Across the city, in a windowless room illuminated only by the glow of computer screens, Gideon hit the final Enter key on his keyboard. A line of green code flashed across the black screen, followed by a digital seal of confirmation from the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority. Gideon picked up his phone and called Valeria. She was sitting in a cheap motel room on the outskirts of town, the thin manila envelope resting on her knees. "It's done." Gideon's exhausted, triumphant voice came through the speaker. "The revocation is filed and accepted. The fraud declaration is stamped. As of 3 minutes ago, Oliver's proxy is legally dissolved. Apex Holdings, and its $342 million in liquid and hard assets, is now officially and exclusively registered to Valeria Cavendish. He is broke, Val. He just doesn't know it yet." Valeria closed her eyes, a long, shuddering breath escaping her lips. The charade was over. The victim was dead. "Print the confirmation, Gideon," Valeria said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. Bring it to the courthouse tomorrow morning. I want him to hand the judge his own death warrant." The heavy oak doors of Department 42 sealed shut behind them with a muffled, definitive thud, instantly cutting off the chaotic murmur of the hallway. The silence inside was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library. It was the tense, suffocating silence of a surgical theater before the first bloody incision. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of nervous sweat. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of morning sunlight filtering through the high, arched windows, illuminating the sprawling mahogany benches and the imposing Great Seal of the State mounted on the wall. Judge Arthur Archer sat high on the bench, a man carved from granite and steeped in decades of legal warfare. He had a reputation for being fiercely intelligent, utterly intolerant of courtroom theatrics, and possessing an uncanny ability to smell a lie from a mile away. He peered over his half-moon reading glasses, his slate-gray eyes sweeping the room with a cynical weariness. He had seen thousands of these cases, the wealthy crushing the weak, and it always left a bitter taste in his mouth. To his right, at the petitioner's table, sat Oliver and Adelaide. They looked like a pair of sleek, predatory sharks that had cornered a wounded seal. Adelaide had her files perfectly aligned, color-coded, and meticulously tabbed, her posture rigid with an aggressive, predatory confidence. Oliver looked profoundly bored. He occasionally flicked a piece of invisible lint from his lapel, checking his gold Rolex, as if the judicial proceedings of his marriage were a tedious interruption to his otherwise brilliant day. To the judge's left, sitting completely alone at the expansive respondent's table, was Valeria. The visual contrast was jarring. She had brought no files, no towering binders of discovery, no paralegal to furiously take notes. There was only the single, thin manila envelope resting perfectly in the center of the dark wood table in front of her. She sat completely motionless, her hands folded, a statue in the eye of a hurricane. Case number 774B902. Cavendish versus Cavendish, Judge Archer announced, his gravelly voice cutting through the stillness and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Petition for dissolution of marriage and division of assets. Are the parties ready to proceed? Ready for the petitioner. Your Honor, Adelaide said, standing smoothly and projecting her voice with practiced, theatrical authority. Mrs. Cavendish? Judge Archer looked down at Valeria, his thick brow furrowing slightly. The court notes you are appearing pro se today, unrepresented. I must remind you that you are bound by the same rules of evidence and procedure as licensed counsel. A courtroom is a dangerous place to be without a guide. Are you absolutely sure you wish to proceed without an attorney? I am sure, Your Honor. I am ready to proceed, Valeria replied, her voice steady, carrying clearly and without a single tremor across the massive room. Oliver let out a barely audible snort, shaking his handsome head as if mourning a tragedy he had nothing to do with. Adelaide shot him a microscopic warning glance, then turned her brilliant, dangerous smile toward the bench. Your Honor, if it pleases the court, I would like to make an opening statement, Adelaide began, stepping out from behind her table. Proceed, Counselor. Adelaide began her masterclass in character assassination. For 20 grueling minutes, she wove a compelling, devastating narrative. She didn't just argue the law. She painted a vivid, agonizing portrait of Oliver as a martyr. She described a hardworking, dedicated husband who had built a boutique investment firm from the ground up, bleeding for his company to provide a luxurious life, only to be dragged down by a wife who was financially reckless, emotionally vacuous, and profoundly parasitic. Your Honor, what we have here is a classic, tragic case of financial vampirism, Adelaide declared, pacing slowly in front of the bench, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm. She held up a thick financial chart. Look at this ledger. A hemorrhage of marital capital. In the last 2 years alone, the respondent spent over $400,000 on wellness retreats and personal reinvention. While my client was quietly liquidating his own retirement accounts, just to keep the lights on in their home. Valeria sat perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask, though internally her mind was a steel trap snapping shut. She remembered those wellness retreats clearly. They were the weeks Oliver had told her he was away on business in Milan and Dubai. Weeks he had actually spent at a private villa in Santorini with Celeste. The audacity of weaponizing his own adultery against her was breathtaking. Despite this, Adelaide continued, pressing a hand to her chest in a gesture of fabricated sincerity. My client has offered a generous, frankly overly compassionate settlement, a $50,000 cash payout, and he will assume sole responsibility for the crushing $5 million in outstanding marital liabilities. The respondent, out of sheer spite, has refused this generous offer. She sits here today, unrepresented by choice, hoping to leverage this court's sympathy to extort money my client simply does not have. We will demonstrate that the marital estate is entirely insolvent, and that the only assets of value belong exclusively to Mr. Cavendish's premarital business entity, Apex Holdings, to which the respondent explicitly, legally, and knowingly waived all rights. Adelaide returned to her seat, smoothing her skirt, looking immensely satisfied. It was a flawless execution of the narrative. Judge Archer turned his heavy gaze to Valeria, his expression guarded. Mrs. Cavendish, do you wish to make an opening statement? Valeria stood up. She didn't pace. She didn't use her hands. She simply looked up at the judge. No, Your Honor. The petitioner's counsel has eloquently outlined their version of reality. I have no desire to argue with fiction. I prefer to let the documents speak for themselves. She sat back down. A sudden, chilling ripple of unease passed through Adelaide. It wasn't the response of a hysterical, defeated woman. It was the response of someone holding a royal flush who was perfectly content to let the other player shove all their chips into the center of the table. She quickly suppressed the feeling. Valeria was bluffing. She had to be. Very well, Judge Archer said, shifting his papers, a hint of impatience bleeding into his tone. Counselor, you may call your first witness. We call Oliver Cavendish to the stand, Your Honor. Oliver stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the witness box with the swagger of a king surveying his conquered lands. He swore the oath, sat down, adjusted his tie, and offered the judge a respectful, charming, almost boyish smile. For the next hour, Adelaide led Oliver through a meticulously choreographed dance of lies. Oliver testified beautifully. He was a natural performer. When discussing their failed marriage, his voice thickened with sorrow. When discussing his crushing business debts, his jaw clenched stoically. Mr. Cavendish, can you describe the emotional toll this financial ruin has taken on you? Adelaide asked softly. Oliver looked down at his hands, wiping a non-existent tear from the corner of his eye. I tried to give her the world, Your Honor. I worked 80-hour weeks. I bled for my firm. I just couldn't keep up with her spending. I was constantly terrified of bankruptcy, of losing everything I had built, while she just demanded more. And regarding your business, Adelaide pivoted smoothly. Is it true that the only remaining assets you have are tied to Apex Holdings? Yes, Oliver said firmly. And those are entirely separate. Premarital assets. Did your wife sign a power of attorney, legally relinquishing any claim to manage or benefit from Apex Holdings? She did, Oliver replied confidently, looking directly at the judge. She understood that the business was separate, and she willingly signed the documents to protect herself from any of my corporate liabilities. No further questions, Your Honor, Adelaide said, returning to her chair in absolute triumph. The nail was in the coffin. Judge Archer looked at Valeria. The pity in his eyes was obvious now. Mrs. Cavendish, you have the right to cross-examine the witness. This is your opportunity to challenge his testimony regarding the debts, the spending, or the nature of this holding company. Valeria looked at Oliver. For a long, suffocating moment, their eyes locked across the courtroom. Oliver's eyes were filled with arrogant victory, silently daring her to speak, to make a fool of herself. Valeria's eyes were dark, fathomless pools of absolute calm. She reached out and let her fingertips brush the edge of the manila envelope. "I have no questions for Mr. Cavendish, Your Honor," Valeria said quietly, the words dropping like stones into a silent pond. "He has said exactly what I needed him to say." A palpable tension settled over the courtroom. Even Judge Archer seemed momentarily thrown by Valeria's absolute lack of defense. An unrepresented litigant failing to cross-examine the primary witness was tantamount to legal suicide. Adelaide leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing on her lips, already calculating her billable hours for the victory celebration. "Very well," Judge Archer said, his tone reflecting a mixture of impatience and pity. "The witness may step down. Counsel, do you have any further witnesses or exhibits to submit before I render a decision?" "Just our final financial disclosures, Your Honor," Adelaide said, standing and carrying a thick, leather-bound binder to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. "This binder contains the authenticated ledgers proving the insolvency of the marital estate, the signed power of attorney, and the corporate charter of Apex Holdings, confirming my client's sole ownership. We respectfully request the court adopt our proposed settlement immediately." Judge Archer opened the heavy binder, briefly flipping through the dense pages of ledgers and legal jargon. He sighed heavily. It was a brutal case, but the paperwork was immaculate. As far as the law was concerned, Valeria Cavendish had signed her life away. "Mrs. Cavendish," Judge Archer said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "The petitioner has submitted extensive documentation proving that there are no marital assets to divide, and that you have legally waived your rights to his corporate holdings. If you have any evidence to the contrary, you must present it now. Otherwise, I will have no choice but to rule in favor of the petitioner and finalize this divorce under their terms." Oliver watched her from the petitioner's table, his eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to cry and plead in front of the judge, to publicly humiliate herself one last time. Valeria stood up. She picked up the thin manila envelope. The paper felt heavy in her hands, vibrating with the weight of justice. She walked out from behind the respondent's table, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, echoing the very sounds that had terrified her in the hallway just an hour ago. Now, they sounded like a drumbeat. She approached the bailiff and handed him the envelope. "Your Honor," Valeria said, her voice ringing out, clear and unwavering. "I do not dispute the petitioner's claim that the marital estate is technically insolvent. I also do not dispute that the vast majority of wealth in this room is tied up in the offshore entity known as Apex Holdings. In fact, I completely agree with Mr. Cavendish's sworn testimony that Apex Holdings contains over $300 million in assets, and that the $5 million in debt he claims to have was actually embezzled funds wired directly into that exact holding company." Adelaide shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor. The respondent is making wild, defamatory accusations without a shred of proof. She is testifying from the floor." "I am not testifying, Your Honor," Valeria said smoothly, not even looking at Adelaide. "I am simply clarifying the facts before you review my submission. The document inside that envelope is not a ledger. It is a certified, federally authenticated filing from the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, time-stamped at 8 a.m. this morning." Judge Archer held up a hand, silencing Adelaide. He opened the envelope and slid out a single, thick piece of heavily watermarked paper. It bore the gold-embossed seal of an international banking authority. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning. Judge Archer adjusted his glasses. He read the first paragraph. His eyebrows drew together. He read the second paragraph, and the color slowly began to drain from his face. He looked up sharply, staring at Oliver, then at Adelaide, and finally, his eyes locked onto Valeria. The air in the room seemed to crackle with sudden, dangerous electricity. "Counselor," Judge Archer's voice was dangerously low, a low rumble of approaching thunder. He was looking at Adelaide. "Are you aware of what this document is?" "It's a forgery, Your Honor." Adelaide spat immediately, though a tiny bead of sweat had formed at her temple. "My client holds the sole proprietary rights to—" "Stop talking!" Judge Archer barked, his voice echoing like a gunshot. Adelaide snapped her mouth shut, stunned. Judge Archer looked back down at the paper, then fixed a glare of pure, unfiltered judicial fury upon Oliver Cavendish. "Mr. Cavendish," Judge Archer began, and the absolute coldness in his tone made Oliver visibly flinch. "You just spent the last hour under oath, swearing to this court that you are the sole, rightful owner of Apex Holdings, and that you require this court to strip your wife of all assets based on that ownership." "That is correct, Your Honor," Oliver said, his voice suddenly sounding thin and reedy. Judge Archer leaned forward, the heavy oak of the bench groaning under his weight. He looked at Oliver with the kind of contempt usually reserved for violent criminals. "Mr. Cavendish," the judge said, delivering the sentence that would shatter Oliver's reality into dust, "I cannot grant you half of the marital estate, because the documents you just submitted prove you committed federal wire fraud. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, according to the irrevocable master trust you blindly signed to hide your wealth, which your wife legally incorporated under her own name, you do not own Apex Holdings. She does, which means you have just perjured yourself to confess to embezzling $5 million from your own wife, and you are currently suing your own boss for money you stole from her." For 5 agonizing seconds, the courtroom existed in a state of suspended animation. The words hung in the air, heavy, impossible, and utterly devastating. Then the avalanche hit. "That's a lie!" Oliver roared, leaping to his feet, his face turning a violent shade of crimson. The bespoke suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. "That's impossible." The proxy was ironclad. "Adelaide, do something." Adelaide was frantically pulling files from her binder, her manicured hands shaking violently. The supreme confidence had vanished, replaced by stark, naked panic. "Your Honor, this must be a clerical error. A fraudulent filing by the respondent. It carries a digital cryptographic seal from the SEC and the Cayman Registry." "Counselor," Judge Archer roared back, slamming his hand onto the bench. "This isn't a photocopy. It's a direct federal authentication. It clearly states that yesterday evening, the legal spouse, Valeria Cavendish, executed a lawful revocation of the proxy power of attorney, citing documented financial fraud, and triggered the default ownership clause. She owns the holding company. She owns the yacht. She owns the offshore accounts. She owns everything." "She can't!" Oliver screamed, slamming his fists onto the table, spittle flying from his lips. The charming, untouchable investment banker was gone, replaced by a cornered, feral animal. "It's my money. I earned it. I hid it. She doesn't know how to run a company. Mr. Cavendish, you will restrain yourself, or I will have the bailiff put you in handcuffs," Judge Archer warned, signaling to the armed officer who immediately stepped closer to Oliver. "You have just admitted to hiding assets during a divorce proceeding, which is a felony. You have admitted to wire fraud, and you did it all under oath in my courtroom, while trying to leave your wife destitute." Valeria stood perfectly still, watching the destruction of the man who had tried to destroy her. She felt no pity. She felt no sorrow. She felt only the clean, piercing light of absolute justice. In the gallery, sitting inconspicuously in the back row, a woman in a green silk blouse suddenly stood up. It was Celeste. She had slipped in to watch the final execution of Valeria, but as the reality of the judge's words washed over her, the color vanished from her face. If Valeria owned Apex Holdings, she owned the yacht Celeste lived on. She owned the accounts that paid Celeste's credit cards. Celeste looked at Oliver, who was hyperventilating at the defense table, and she made a split-second, ruthless calculation. She turned on her heel and sprinted for the courtroom doors, desperate to flee before the financial authorities froze her personal accounts. "Stop that woman," Valeria said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. It was the first time she had spoken since the revelation. The bailiff at the door immediately stepped in front of Celeste, blocking her exit. Celeste let out a shrill gasp. "Trapped. Your Honor." Valeria addressed the bench, her voice ringing with the quiet authority of a queen reclaiming her throne. "The $5 million in debt my husband mentioned was transferred out of our joint accounts and wired into Apex Holdings to purchase a luxury vessel. That vessel is currently registered under the name of Celeste Montgomery," the woman standing by the door. "As the legal owner of the funds used to purchase that stolen asset, I will be filing civil charges for grand larceny against both of them. I request she not be allowed to leave the jurisdiction." Adelaide collapsed into her chair, dropping her pen. She realized with horrifying clarity that she was completely implicated. She had drafted the forged ledgers. She had submitted the perjured documents. Her career wasn't just over. She was facing disbarment and federal prison time. She looked at Valeria, not with contempt anymore, but with profound, terrifying awe. She had underestimated the wife, and the wife had burned her to the ground. "This is a conspiracy," Oliver shrieked, tears of sheer rage and panic streaming down his face. "She set me up! She tricked me!" "No, Oliver," Valeria said softly, turning to look him directly in the eyes. "You built the trap. You set the bait. You locked the cage. I just held the mirror." Judge Archer slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack silencing the room. "Order. Order in this court. Mr. Cavendish, your petition for division of assets is denied. The divorce is granted, with all assets defaulting to the respondent as per the true legal ownership established today. Furthermore, I am holding you and your counsel in direct contempt of court for submitting forged evidence and committing perjury." The judge looked at the bailiff. "Take Mr. Cavendish into custody, pending an emergency hearing with the district attorney regarding the federal fraud charges. And have someone call the SEC. I believe they are going to want to see these ledgers." The click of the handcuffs closing around Oliver Cavendish's wrists was the loudest sound Valeria had ever heard. It was the sound of a 10-year nightmare finally ending. Oliver didn't fight the bailiff. He seemed to have gone into a state of catatonic shock. His bespoke suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his face slack with the realization that he had lost absolutely everything. As the bailiff led him past Valeria, Oliver stopped. He looked at her, his eyes hollow, desperate. "Val," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Valeria, please. We were married. You can't do this to me. I'll have nothing." Valeria looked at him. She saw the man she had loved, the man who had manipulated her, gaslit her, and tried to leave her to starve while he drank champagne with his mistress. "You told me I was delusional, Oliver," Valeria replied, her voice soft, carrying only to his ears. "You told me I was losing my mind, but my mind is the only thing you couldn't steal. Enjoy the nothing you created." She turned away from him. The bailiff tugged Oliver forward, leading him out of the courtroom and into the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. Adelaide sat frozen at the table, her head in her hands, her career reduced to ash. Celeste was being questioned by a court officer by the door, her green silk blouse suddenly looking cheap and desperate. "Mrs. Cavendish," Judge Archer called out gently. Valeria turned back to the bench. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen a lot of cruelty," the judge said, pulling off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "And I have seen a lot of victims. It is a rare privilege to see someone refuse to be one. You played a very dangerous game, but you played it brilliantly. The court will process the transfer orders immediately. Good luck to you." "Thank you, Your Honor," Valeria said, bowing her head slightly. She turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors swung open for her, no longer a barrier to a slaughterhouse, but the gateway to her freedom. She stepped out into the marble corridor. It was empty now, the chaotic energy of the morning having dissipated. She walked out of the courthouse and down the wide concrete steps. The afternoon sun was blindingly bright, warming her cold skin. The air tasted incredibly sweet. Across the street, standing next to a sleek, black town car, was Gideon. He was holding 2 large cups of black coffee, looking less exhausted and more alive than he had in years, when he saw Valeria emerge from the shadows of the courthouse. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. Valeria walked across the street, taking the coffee from his hand. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city move around them. "So," Gideon finally said, taking a sip of his coffee, "you are currently the CEO of a multinational holding company with $300 million in assets. What's your first executive order?" Valeria looked up at the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district, the domain that Oliver had once ruled. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 10 years finally lift from her shoulders, dissolving into the bright blue sky. She had walked into the fire as a broken wife, and she had walked out, forged in steel. "First," Valeria said, a true, brilliant smile finally breaking across her face, "we liquidate the yacht. And then, we take back everything else." Valeria's journey reminds us that true strength doesn't always roar loudly. Sometimes, it is the quiet, meticulous planning of a woman who refuses to be a victim. When the world tries to bury you, you don't just survive. You become the architect of your own fierce resurrection. Karma is rarely an accident. It is the inevitable, crushing collision of arrogance and truth. Oliver believed his wealth made him untouchable, but in the end, his own deceit built the cage that trapped him forever. If Valeria's triumphant story of justice and poetic karma resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this incredible story with all your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling dramas and satisfying twists today.